They can't shut down physics. California, early 1941. The desert heat rippled off the runway at Muroc Field, a proving ground dressed up as a test pilot's graveyard. A sleek silver fighter, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, waited at the end of the strip. Twin engines gleamed under the morning sun, the air shimmering with a lethal promise. In the control tower, young lieutenants leaned forward, clipboards trembling in their hands. On the radio, a calm, chilling voice. Lightning 1, ready for high-speed dive test. Beginning run. The pilot, Captain Elias, Buzz Vance, pushed the throttle. The twin Allison engines roared like thunder, a primal scream. The plane climbed, a silver speck ascending until it vanished against the sun's glare. At 30,000 feet, Vance tipped the nose down. The Lightning dove, clean, elegant, deadly, fast. 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. Then, the silence. The radio crackled, the calm voice now edged with panic. Controls stiffening. Controls locked. The senior flight officer in the tower, Major Marcus Iron Thorn, paled, his voice tight. Pull up, Vance, pull up. But the pilot couldn't. The stick wouldn't move. The air around the Lightning thickened like invisible concrete. The wings shuddered, the tail vibrated, and the altimeter spun down like a falling clock. The last thing anyone saw was a glint of silver smashing into the desert floor. The explosion echoed across miles of sand. Smoke rose into a perfect blue sky. In the tower, Chief Engineer Ace Rourke, only 31 years old, stood silent, a figure of rigid despair. The others whispered, "Another one lost." Someone muttered, "This plane will kill our own pilots." That night, Rourke sat alone in the hangar beside the twisted wreckage. The P-38 had been his vision, America's first high-altitude, long-range interceptor. It was supposed to outrun everything in the sky. Instead, it was killing the men who flew it. He lit a cigarette, the smoke acrid. Staring at the scorched aluminum, a grizzled mechanic, Sergeant Wrench Miller, approached carefully. "Orders are coming from Washington, sir. They might shut us down." Rourke exhaled smoke and whispered, "They can't shut down physics." Miller frowned. "You mean the controls freezing up?" Rourke nodded. "Compressibility. Air turns solid at those speeds. We hit the wall before we even saw it." He took out a small notebook, flipping through pages of sketches, wing flaps, airflow diagrams, strange curves, and numbers. He circled one idea in red, dive recovery flaps experimental. To the Army Air Forces, it was madness. The P-38 was already considered a Widowmaker. Engineers were quitting the project, but Rourke saw something the others didn't. He told his team the next morning, his voice raw with conviction, "We're not scrapping her. We're teaching her to fly faster than fear." An older engineer scoffed. "You're talking about defying the laws of physics," Rourke replied. "No, I'm talking about understanding them." In that moment, the legend of Ace Rourke began, not in triumph, but in failure so total it became the seed of reinvention. Narration tightens. The Army wrote off the P-38 as dangerous, but one civilian refused to accept death as a design flaw. His impossible idea would make the Lightning untouchable and turn America's deadliest mistake into its greatest weapon. As dawn broke over the hangar, Rourke sketched again, cigarette smoke curling over the paper. The words on the top of the page, "If it kills us, it's not the plane's fault. It's ours for not fixing it." The sound fades to a single engine starting up outside. Somewhere in the desert, another pilot climbed into another cockpit, praying that this time the Lightning would fly true. By the spring of 1942, the P-38 Lightning had a reputation, and not the one Lockheed had dreamed of. Pilots whispered its nickname in the barracks, the Widowmaker. The design was revolutionary, twin booms, twin engines, and a cockpit pod that made it look more like a spacecraft than an airplane. But what looked like the future often ended in fire. Dive too steep, accelerate too long, and the plane froze solid. No control, no recovery, no second chance. Newspapers loved the drama. Experimental fighter claims, another test pilot. The Army Air Forces grew uneasy. They had spent millions on the project, but the Lightning's performance came at a price too high to ignore. At Eglin Field in Florida, Test pilot Lieutenant Jake Stone Riley sat on the wing of his P-38, sweat streaking down his face. "You can feel it," he said. "You pull back and the stick turns to stone. She's not a plane anymore. She's a bullet." To some generals, the solution was simple. Stop building them. Scrap the project before it embarrassed the Air Corps. One colonel wrote bluntly in a report, "This design is fundamentally unsafe at high speed." But not everyone agreed. Among the engineers, a divide formed between those who feared what the Lightning could do and those who feared what would happen if they gave up on it. Ace Rourke was in the second camp. He studied the crash reports and saw a pattern. The failures weren't random. They happened at the same speeds, the same altitudes, the same angles. Something invisible, something new, was crushing the aircraft before pilots even realized it. "It's not the machine," he told his team one night, pacing the drafting room. "It's the air itself. We're flying into walls we can't see." His peers dismissed it as wishful thinking. "You can't fix air, Ace," one of them laughed. "You can't out-engineer gravity." But Rourke wasn't trying to fix air. He wanted to control it. He began sketching strange shapes on tracing paper, tiny flaps that would change the way air flowed around the wing at high speed, a safety valve for the sky. To his colleagues, it looked like nonsense, extra drag, extra weight. To him, it looked like survival. Meanwhile, on the front lines, P-38 pilots in Europe and North Africa were learning to respect the Lightning's fury. It could outclimb and outturn almost anything in the air, but every man who flew it knew. If you dove too long, you were gambling your life. One ace, Lieutenant Chester Blitz Bodine, summed it up best. The P-38 was a thoroughbred that tried to kill you if you didn't understand it. The army wanted a weapon. Rourke was building a teacher, and soon he'd prove that the very thing pilots feared most, speed, wasn't the Lightning's curse. It was its destiny. Before the P-38 ever took flight, America was already fighting a different kind of war, a race of blueprints, engines, and nerves. The year was 1940, and across the Atlantic, Hitler's Luftwaffe owned the skies. Britain was burning, France had fallen, and America was still clinging to neutrality. But deep inside California's Lockheed plant, the future was already taking shape. The U.S. Army Air Corps had issued an impossible request, a fighter that could climb higher, fly farther, and strike harder than anything in existence. Most companies laughed. Lockheed didn't. Inside a converted garage in Burbank, a small group of engineers led by Ace Rourke began designing something the world had never seen. 2 engines for reliability, turbo superchargers for power at altitude, a central pod for the pilot, the guns aligned perfectly with the nose, so bullets would strike precisely where the sights aimed. They called it the Interceptor of Tomorrow. In the beginning, the P-38 wasn't meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be unbeatable. Rourke's early sketches looked alien twin tails, tricycle landing gear, a shape unlike any fighter before it. One senior officer reportedly stared at the mock-up and muttered, "That thing looks like it flew here from Mars." But what mattered wasn't looks, it was performance. And the Lightning delivered. In its first test flights, it shattered every record on the books. 400 miles per hour at altitude, unheard of for a piston-driven aircraft. When the Army saw the data, they ordered it into production immediately. By 1941, Lockheed's Burbank plant had become a temple of noise and innovation. Over 50,000 workers filled the floor, men, women, engineers, and machinists working under floodlights through the night. Sparks flew, rivet guns echoed, and the smell of hot aluminum filled the air. Every P-38 that rolled off the line was a mechanical marvel and a ticking mystery. Because for all its power, the Lightning hit a secret flaw no one yet understood. During high-speed dives, something invisible happened. The air around the wings compressed faster than the aircraft could move through it. Pressure built unevenly, freezing control surfaces and pinning pilots in their seats. Rourke knew the risk, but he also knew the alternative. "If we don't build faster airplanes," he told the Army, "we'll lose the war before we even enter it." He pushed forward, and the Lightning took to the skies just in time for America's entry into World War II. When Japanese planes struck Pearl Harbor, the U.S. needed speed, altitude, and range, and only the P-38 could deliver all three. To the public, The Lightning was America's futuristic sword. To the men who built it, it was still an experiment. And for the pilots who would fly it into battle, it was a question with no guarantee of survival. By late 1942, the P-38 Lightning was no longer a prototype. It was a weapon of war. In the skies over North Africa, a young lieutenant named Robin Bulldog Olds tightened his harness, looked at the twin props spinning before him, and muttered, "All right, sweetheart, let's see what you can do." The mission was simple: escort bombers over Tunisia and intercept German Messerschmitts. But nothing in training had prepared the pilots for what they were about to face. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin and the sun sharp. The Lightning's engines purred like a promise. When radar picked up incoming German fighters, Olds pushed the throttles forward, and the P-38 leapt ahead like a hunting cat. Then the battle began. Messerschmitt Bf, 109 seconds, and Focke-Wulf 4, 190 seconds, swarmed in from above, sharp and fast. But the Lightning didn't fight fair. It fought with speed. American pilots dove into the attack, the twin. 50 caliber guns in the nose spitting streams of fire. German pilots, used to slow, turning, single-engine opponents, suddenly faced a predator that hit from high above, then vanished before they could react. In those first encounters, German radio chatter captured their disbelief. Zwei Motoren, unmöglich. 2 engines, impossible. But the Lightning had one flaw. When a pilot tried to dive too steeply chasing an enemy, the controls would lock up. The plane became a missile. In the chaos of combat, that flaw claimed lives as surely as enemy bullets. Lieutenant Olds later recalled, "It wasn't the Germans that scared me. It was gravity." Back at base, reports poured in. The P-38 was both a miracle and a menace. Lightning fast, brutally armed, but dangerously unstable in a dive. The Army wanted results, not explanations. Lockheed's engineers wanted answers. In Burbank, Ace Rourke read those pilot reports with grim focus. The Lightning's success on the battlefield meant nothing if it killed its own men. "Every victory written in blood," he said quietly, "is a design failure we haven't fixed yet." He ordered flight tests to replicate the dives that froze controls. Most pilots refused. One didn't. Test pilot Lieutenant Jake Stone Riley. Riley climbed to 35,000 feet in a modified P-38 and dove until the speedometer blurred. At 420 miles per hour, the control stick turned to granite. The earth spun below him. He blacked out for a second, woke to see the ground rushing up. He fought the stick with every ounce of strength, barely leveling out in time to land with shaking hands. When he stepped out of the cockpit, he walked straight to Rourke's office and said, "You've got your data. Now fix this death trap." That night, Rourke didn't sleep. He pinned Riley's report above his drafting table and drew one phrase, underlined twice. The pilot must always win the fight against the plane. It was a simple truth, but the solution would change the science of flight forever. For weeks, Ace Rourke haunted the Lockheed plant like a man possessed. He read every crash report, every maintenance log, every test flight note. Each one told the same story: control, freeze, loss of lift, compression, shock. Pilots weren't dying because they made mistakes. They were dying because physics itself turned against them. Rourke called his senior engineers into the drafting room. "The air becomes a wall at those speeds," he said, tapping the chalkboard. "We're not fighting metal anymore. We're fighting sound." It was a radical thought. In 1943, the word compressibility was just entering the vocabulary of aviation. No one fully understood it, not even scientists at NASA. The problem was simple to describe and almost impossible to solve. As the P-38 dove toward transonic speeds, the air pressure around the wings shifted so violently that the elevator, the one surface controlling pitch, simply stopped responding. The plane wasn't defective. It was too advanced for its own time. But Rourke refused to accept that the laws of physics would ground his aircraft. One night, staring at blueprints, he noticed something small. A subtle bend in the airflow data taken from earlier prototypes. He circled the spot and murmured, "What if we could bleed off the pressure right here?" By morning, the idea had evolved into a crude sketch. Small metal panels mounted under the wings, flaps that could change the wing's shape during a dive. controlling airflow and giving pilots back their authority over the plane. They called them dive recovery flaps. The concept was untested, unapproved, and according to military officials, unnecessary. One colonel sneered, "You're suggesting we bolt barn doors onto a fighter plane." But Rourke wouldn't budge. He took personal responsibility, authorizing the modification even before the army signed off. Technically, it was illegal. Practically, it was brilliant. The first tests began at Muroc Dry Lake, what would later become Edwards Air Force Base. Jake Stone Riley volunteered again. This time, the P-38 carried the strange new flaps on its underside like a set of metallic scars. He took the Lightning to 35,000 feet, rolled into a dive, and pushed past 450 miles per hour. The familiar vibration began, the air thickening, the control stick turning to stone. He flipped the new switch. And then, silence. The stick came alive again. The nose lifted. The plane obeyed. Riley pulled out smooth and steady, laughing into his oxygen mask. "Rourke, you mad genius?" he radioed. "It works." When the test report reached Washington, it read like a miracle. Compressibility, effect successfully mitigated. Control restored at high Mach. For the first time in aviation history, an aircraft had solved the sound barrier problem without breaking apart. The P-38 Lightning had gone from Widowmaker to world beater. Rourke's unapproved fix became official doctrine overnight. Factories scrambled to retrofit hundreds of Lightnings with dive flaps, saving untold numbers of pilots who might otherwise have died. It was more than an engineering triumph. It was proof of something deeper, that America's strength came not from obedience, but from the courage to break rules in the service of survival. By mid-1944, the newly modified P-38 Lightnings roared back into Europe's skies, faster, deadlier, and now fully under the control of their pilots. The nickname Widowmaker began to fade, replaced by one whispered even among German aces, Der Doppelweh, the twin-tailed devil. In Italy, Captain Jack Iron Hand Ilfrey led one of the first missions using the upgraded model. His orders were simple: escort B-17 bombers over enemy territory and clear the way for ground forces advancing toward Rome. But that morning, thick clouds rolled over the Alps, and radio contact faded to static. When the formation broke through the cloud layer, the German Luftwaffe was waiting. Dozens of Mi-109 seconds glinting in the sunlight, descending like falcons. The P-38 seconds spread out into combat formation, and for the first time, the odds didn't terrify them. Ilfrey dove first, throttles to the limit. In the old P-38, that maneuver would have been suicide, the controls freezing, the aircraft becoming a falling coffin. But this time, as he plunged past 25,000 feet, he flipped the new dive flap switch. The wings steadied, the nose obeyed. He leveled just above the treetops and came up firing. The Lightning's nose-mounted guns, 50 caliber Brownings, and a 20mm cannon unleashed a storm of lead so precise that the first Mi-109 disintegrated in mid-air before its pilot even saw him coming. Other Lightnings followed suit, streaking in from impossible angles, firing, climbing, then diving again. The German formation shattered. Pilots who had once laughed at America's clumsy twin-engine fighter now found themselves outflanked, outgunned, and outnumbered in the sky. Over the radio, an American voice crackled through laughter. "They can't hide from the thunder and lightning." By the end of that day, the P-38 squadron claimed 12 confirmed kills without a single loss. Reports from bomber crews described the Lightnings as angels with fire in their wings. Word spread fast through Luftwaffe intelligence networks. German pilots began receiving briefings, warning them to avoid combat with twin-boom fighters. One captured ace later told Allied interrogators, "When we saw that forked tail, we knew we were already dead." But for the men flying the P-38, the victory was bittersweet. Many of them had lost friends to the earlier compressibility problem. The new flaps couldn't bring those men back. What they did bring was redemption and respect. Tony Riley, now a national hero, toured the bases, teaching combat pilots how to use the dive system effectively. "This plane will take you anywhere you dare to go," he said in one briefing. "Just don't forget it's smarter than it looks, but only if you fly smarter than you did yesterday." The Lightning's reputation soared from Europe to the Pacific. It became America's long-range eyes and claws. It hunted bombers over Germany, intercepted Zeros over New Guinea, and even claimed the most famous kill of the Pacific War, the shoot-down of Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft in 1943, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor himself. The message was clear to the Axis and the Allies alike. The P-38 Lightning wasn't just a plane. It was the embodiment of American ingenuity, the proof that when ordinary men refused to accept impossible, even physics had to yield. While Europe saw the Lightning's evolution from flawed experiment to fighter legend, the Pacific turned it into a symbol of vengeance. Here, in the humid skies over the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, the P-38 became both sword and shield for the Allied advance. Pilots who had once doubted its bulk and twin engines now prayed for their missions to be flown in the fork-tailed Devil. The long-range, deadly accuracy, and unmatched reliability made it a natural predator across the vast Pacific, where distances killed almost as many men as bullets. Major Richard King Bong, the quiet farm boy from Wisconsin, strapped into his P-38 every morning with a ritual, a pat on the control stick, and a whispered, "Let's bring them home, Lightning." Core. He would go on to become America's top Ace 40 confirmed kills, all in a P-38. The Lightning's design made it perfect for the Pacific's brutal environment. While Japanese Zeros could outturn most American planes, they couldn't outrun or outclimb the twin-engine juggernaut. Bong and his fellow pilots perfected boom and zoom tactics, high-speed dives followed by vertical climbs that left Zeros spinning helplessly below. In one dogfight over Bougainville, Bong spotted a formation of 6 enemy fighters. He dove from 20,000 feet, firing a precise 1-second burst that tore through the lead Zero's cockpit. Before the rest could react, he pulled into a climb so steep that his Lightning nearly stalled. The Japanese pilots tried to follow and lost. The survivors reported later that the two-tailed monster moved faster than the wind itself. Meanwhile, other P-38 squadrons were rewriting the map of the Pacific. Using their long-range tanks and powerful engines, they reached places no other Allied fighter could. Reconnaissance units flew thousands of miles across open ocean, photographing enemy installations that even Japanese intelligence didn't know existed. The most famous mission came on April 18, 1943. U.S. Navy codebreakers intercepted a message revealing that Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville. 16 P-38 seconds took off from Guadalcanal, flying 600 miles at wave-top level to avoid detection. At exactly 9:34 a.m., they climbed into position. When Yamamoto's transport appeared, 2 Lightnings flown by Captain Rex Deadeye Barber and Lieutenant Thomas Tomcat Lanier executed perfect intercepts. Within seconds, the Admiral's plane exploded into the jungle canopy. The man who had planned America's greatest humiliation was dead, killed by America's most advanced fighter. The mission was more than vengeance. It was proof that precision, planning, and courage could reach farther than hatred ever could. For the Japanese, the Lightning became a legend wrapped in fear. They called it Nitsubi, 2 suns, for the gleam of its twin engines in the sky. For American pilots, it became something more personal, the machine that brought them home. At bases across the Pacific, mechanics painted names on the noses: California Cutie, Fork Fury, Double Trouble. Each one told a story, and somewhere in Burbank, Ace Rourke read the dispatches and smiled faintly. The plane he'd once feared might be a failure was now rewriting the rules of aerial warfare and the destiny of nations. By the final year of the war, the P-38 Lightning had become more than a weapon. It was a legend, but for every ace pilot who made headlines, there were hundreds of mechanics whose hands turned bolts, patched holes, and risked their lives to keep the aircraft in the air. One of them was Sergeant Jedediah Mac McNeil, a grease-stained genius from Oklahoma. He wasn't an engineer, not a test pilot, not a man of fame. He was the one who stayed up through the night when a plane came back, riddled with holes, or when a cooling line burst halfway through a mission. It was McNeil's illegal fix, the one the manual forbade, that changed everything for his squadron. After a mission where 2 Lightnings were lost to overheating engines, He took a wrench and modified the intercooler bypass manually, adjusting the airflow mix beyond regulation limits. His commanding officer was furious. "You voided the Army's maintenance spec, Sergeant." McNeil simply wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Sir, I just saved 2 engines and maybe 4 lives." The next day, his modification was tested. The Lightning ran cooler, climbed faster, and came home stronger. Within a week, the trick spread through every mechanic in the field. It wasn't in any official directive, just quiet word of mouth passed from one exhausted crew chief to another. The pilots noticed. "I don't know what you did to her, Mac," one lieutenant said, "but she feels like she wants to fight now." That one unapproved fix, born from common sense and desperation, became a hallmark of the American war effort. Trust the man on the ground. The P-38 wasn't just an aircraft born of innovation, it was sustained by it. When parts ran out, crews improvised. When manuals failed, they adapted. When someone said, "It can't be done," a mechanic somewhere proved otherwise. It was the same spirit that Ace Rourke had carried when he sketched the Lightning on a napkin, a faith that the rules mattered less than results when lives were on the line. As victory approached, the Lightning's legend grew. It escorted bombers deep into Germany, strafed convoys across France, and chased Japanese fighters from the Pacific skies. And behind every successful mission was a story like McNeil's, unrecorded, uncelebrated, but vital. After the war, he returned home to a small farm outside Tulsa. When asked by a reporter what he thought of the P-38, McNeil smiled and said, "She was a fighter that wouldn't quit, kind of like us." Today, few remember his name, but every P-38 that survived the war carried his spirit, the belief that ingenuity was America's true armor. Historians often point to the pilots, the factories, the generals, but it was the mechanics who disobeyed manuals to save wings, the engineers who defied physics, and the test pilots who defied fear, who turned blueprints into miracles. The Lightning's roar across the sky was not just the sound of engines. It was the echo of a nation's belief that no obstacle was unbreakable, not even the impossible. By late 1945, the skies that had once been filled with the roar of twin Allison engines were beginning to fall silent. The war was ending, and with it, the age of the prop-driven Titan. Yet the P-38 Lightning's final months in service were anything but quiet. Across Europe, Lightning squadrons led the last missions over collapsing German front lines. Pilots who had once cursed the aircraft's quirks now begged to stay in it until the very last sortie. It was fast, reliable, and for many, home. In April 1945, over Munich, Lieutenant Frank Hammer Hurlbut led a flight of P-38 seconds on one of their final combat operations in Europe. The target was a retreating armored column attempting to cross the Isar River. "We came in low," Hurlbut wrote later, "and the tanks looked like toys in the distance. When we opened up with the 50s, they stopped moving." It was a fitting farewell for the aircraft that had started its life fighting for respect. In the Pacific, the Lightning's twin boom still sliced through the sky over Okinawa, escorting bombers and strafing Japanese airfields in the final desperate days. But the end was already written. In hangars across the world, the new generation of fighters, the jet-powered P-80 Shooting Star, waited for their turn. Still, even as the Lightning prepared for retirement, its legend grew. Ace Rourke's design team at Lockheed had already moved on to jet research, but the lessons learned from the P-38 shaped every aircraft that followed. The Lightning had pioneered concepts that became cornerstones of modern aviation: turbocharging, redundant systems, high-altitude performance, and pilot survivability. The aircraft that had once terrified its own pilots was now studied in flight schools as a model of design evolution. In post-war interviews, Luftwaffe aces admitted that the Lightning was one of the few Allied fighters they truly feared. "It could climb faster than we could dive," said German pilot Franz Stigler. It wasn't just a plane, it was a machine that made no mistakes. In America, returning aces like King Bong and Major Thomas Iron Mike Maguire became national heroes, their names etched into aviation history. Yet both men died before the war's end. Bong in a jet test flight accident, Maguire in combat over the Philippines. Their deaths marked both triumph and transition, the old world giving way to the new. When the last Lightning squadron stood down in 1946, Thousands of the aircraft were scrapped, melted down into peacetime metal. But for those who flew her, the P-38 was more than steel and rivets. It was courage in motion. Jake Stone Riley, the test pilot who had once stared death in the face to solve compressibility, summed it up best at a post-war ceremony. "She tried to kill me once. Then she taught me how to fly better than I ever had before. That's not a plane. That's a teacher." The world moved on to jets, but the lessons of the Lightning never faded. Because in every leap of technology, in every daring design that defied convention, there echoed that same Lockheed belief, one that defined the P-38 from its first sketch to its last flight. Impossible is just an engineering problem waiting for a wrench. The war ended, the factories went silent, and the pilots went home. But the P-38 Lightning refused to fade into history quietly. Across the deserts of Arizona, the jungles of the Pacific, and the airfields of post-war Europe, the twin-tailed fighter still carried stories. Stories of men who had once believed in the impossible and then proved it could fly. In the years after 1945, hundreds of surplus Lightnings were sold to foreign air forces. Some flew under the insignias of Italy, Honduras, and even France. They served as trainers, reconnaissance aircraft, and patrol fighters in forgotten wars and quiet skies. Others found their way into civilian hands. Former pilots, nostalgic and stubborn, bought their old war machines for pennies on the dollar. They restored them, raced them, and kept them alive long after the world had moved on to jets. At air shows, the P-38 became a ghost from another age, a reminder that courage and invention don't expire. One story stands out from 1947. A retired crew chief named Sergeant Jedediah Mac McNeil, the same mechanic whose illegal fix had made his Lightning run cooler in Italy, visited an airbase where the last remaining P-38 squadron was being decommissioned. The aircraft were lined up, engines cold, propellers still. He walked slowly past each one, running his hand along the metal skin, remembering the nights he'd worked by flashlight to keep them alive. When a young airman asked if he wanted to see the new jets, McNeil just smiled. "Son," he said, "those might fly faster, but they'll never have a soul like these did." The Lightning became a bridge between eras, the last great piston-driven predator before the dawn of jet warfare. It had begun as a risky prototype drawn on a napkin and ended as one of the most versatile and feared aircraft of the war. Historians still debate what made the P-38 so special. Was it Ace Rourke's revolutionary design, the twin engines that gave it both power and safety, the pilots who learned to master its quirks? Or was it something deeper, a reflection of the very idea of America itself, imperfect, defiant, always innovating? In 1992, a P-38 named Glacier Girl was pulled from under 268 feet of Greenland ice, perfectly preserved after 50 years. Mechanics restored her to flight, and when her engines roared back to life, the sound wasn't just mechanical, it was ancestral, a resurrection of the spirit that had carried a generation through the darkest war in history. When she lifted off once again, her twin booms gleaming in the sun, old pilots wept. They said it was like seeing a friend come back from the dead. Today, only a handful of P-38 seconds still fly, but each one is a time machine. They carry with them not just the memory of battles fought, but of the men and women who believed that no failure was final, no limit absolute. As one veteran put it best at an air show decades later, "We built her to fight a war, but she taught us how to win by never giving up." The P-38 Lightning was more than a weapon. It was a promise kept, a symbol of what happens when faith in human ingenuity outflies fear itself.